Good evening and welcome, a very warm welcome to our May live stream here on Hedgehogs Hollow. My name is Mike and very warm welcome to you for joining. As always, do let us know in the comments where you are joining from, and I will read out some of those that have already started leaving some comments. Let me know where in the world you're joining from, and if you're in the UK, what part of the UK, what town or village you might be in. It is my very great privilege, pleasure, and all those types of wondrous words to describe. My guest this evening is Dr. Lucy Bearman-Brown. Very warm welcome to you, Lucy. Thank you for taking the time and thank you for joining me. You are genuinely my first PhD to join me on the live stream. Thank you very much for that. We were chatting a little bit earlier, and just to introduce you, you are not just a PhD, you're a senior lecturer in animal sciences at Hartpury University, but very interestingly, you did your PhD genuinely on hedgehogs.
I did, yes. I've just finished my PhD in mammal ecology, focusing on hedgehogs at the University of Reading.
Absolutely brilliant. So you are, and I know we said that Sophie Rasmussen over in Denmark is the hedgehog doctor, but you genuinely are a PhD of hedgehogs, which is makes you a subject matter expert to say the very least.
So Sophie and I are Dr. Hedgehog.
Dr. Hedgehog.
Yeah.
But what's really interesting, and just to kind of loop back, we've just been in Hedgehog Awareness Week, a week that at the beginning of May was sponsored and really promoted the topic of hedgehogs, especially organizations like the British Hedgehog Preservation Society and People's Trust for Endangered Species. But even when I was talking to Hugh and we had our live stream with Hugh Warwick, he was saying that your research is specifically funded. There's funding from those two organizations into hedgehog research. Tell me a little bit more about that and how that works.
Yes, I've been working on projects funded by BHPS and PTS for 6 years now, I think it is, 6 or 7 years. And that's been on various different projects. So trying to kind of all work together really to, work collaboratively, can't say the word, to address some of the challenges that we're seeing with hedgehogs. So they funded a couple of studies that I've worked on. So the overwinter hedgehog behaviour and survival study that I did, and then also the detection dog work as well, they funded.
Fantastic. And it is really great to see that. And I think it was something that came up during the Hedgehog Awareness Week, when talking to different organizations, talking to different people who are running different projects, just the coordination that happens between these organizations and these different research projects, these different kind of almost, I want to say, organizational projects that are happening at a local level. They're all kind of somehow interrelated, and as you were saying earlier, all singing from the same hymn sheet and the same page.
Absolutely, and that's absolutely fundamental. If we're going to achieve anything, if we're going to protect a species and actually have a really positive impact on their conservation, it has to be through collaborative working. So different university groups, I mean there's a good kind of half dozen universities that are all contributing in different ways specifically towards the work that we're all doing. There's wildlife trusts, there's PTS, BHPS as the obvious partners, and that's having a really positive impact. I think having that regular communication between us. We have research updates that we send out, things like that PTS and BHPS are really positive about, kind of spreading the word about the work that we're doing and working together on those different projects. Yeah,
and equally they are very excited about when that research is released. I know your research, when it came out, was well published and promoted by those organizations. We were talking about Sophie Rasmussen, her research, she just recently had another publication, and that was well promoted by those organizations. So it's kind of not just funding the research, so to speak, but then getting it out into the public domain and really promoting that. And that's why we're here ultimately, because I saw some of that promotion about some of your research and we got chatting. So welcome along.
Thank you.
Before we carry on, it's always great just to say hello to everyone who is around, like Sammy from Worcestershire, which is just up the road from me in Gloucestershire. Stevie, welcome again from North Yorkshire, a regular from North Yorkshire. Mark's in Newcastle. It's fantastic to have people from all around the country, down in London, in Wimbledon. Those are probably urban hedgehogs if they're at Wimbledon Common. Oh, there's so many things that we could go into about the Wombles or the hedgehogs of Wimbledon Common. West Berkshire, hello, Kate, welcome. George is in Norfolk. It's wonderful to have everyone. Helen, welcome again from Shropshire. And Anna, a regular from Oxford. So welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining. We are now going to really get to grips with Lucy's research, because as you mentioned the two papers that you've got. The one is around overwintering and nesting, and the other is very kind of, it's tantalizingly called Comparing the Non-Invasive Surveying Techniques for Elusive Nocturnal Mammals, a case study of the West European hedgehog. And what's really interesting is the word surveying is used quite a lot within this research. But it's interesting to note that even though this was a scientific paper, somehow we all survey hedgehogs one way or another.
Absolutely, yeah. So, it might be people are seeing them in their gardens. It might be that, on the dog walk, on the, late evenings and things like that around the local park or across the golf course, those sorts of things. Yeah, absolutely. So, it becomes surveying when we're kind of, doing something routine and kind of structured. And then also utilizing those data for something that hopefully has a positive contribution. So, contributing towards things like big hedgehog map and the Mammal Society's Mammal Mapper app. Those sorts of things, when we're actually kind of contributing those data somewhere, otherwise it's kind of, just general observations really.
So let's just unpick those terms, because I don't want them to be too scientific. Having researched and looked up your work, I know that these are things that genuinely we all are doing in our backyard. So let's just unpick surveying. There are a couple of methods, and we'll get into the methods specifically in your paper, but some of the things that what are some of the methods that people genuinely would very likely be doing in their own backyards that would fall under this category or this description of surveying? Okay, so there are different projects that have run previously. So actually the RSPB's Big Garden Bird Watch. So that's in January every year, and does include various mammals. I think nobody's told the RSPB that hedgehogs aren't birds, but never mind. So yeah, we've got things like the Big Garden Bird Watch is kind of one of the really long running ones. There's British Trust for Ornithology do various things. There's also the Mammal Mapper, and then there's one Hedgehogs on Roads, which is sadly recording hedgehog fatalities, and again that's via an app from the People's Trust for Endangered Species, I think it is. Mm-hmm. So yeah, lots of different options really. So some recording live hedgehogs in gardens and things. There's also the Living with Mammals survey as well. So they're kind of having that opportunity to have some sort of structure, it might be for 24 hours, it might be over, a week or a weekend, or those sorts of things. So a set period of time when you're actively looking for them, and then reporting those observations somewhere, so those data can go towards a kind of much bigger study. Okay. And again, it's very much, I seem to be impressing this point a lot, but it's very much things that, even though this is a scientific study, these are things that everyone can do. Things like the footprint tunnels, and you talk about even using a torch, and surveying with a torch is something that I find myself doing very much late at night and looking for the hedgehogs. But what's the importance then? You spoke about both surveying and getting the information, but reporting it somewhere. So what's the importance of that, not just kind of holding on to that information? Why are these different surveys and kind of places where we can deposit the information so important? Well, as a nation, we have kind of probably one of the best studied
biodiversity experience is going really anywhere in the world. You know, we have lots of people who are very interested. We have lots of people who maybe regularly go out and look for wildlife. And, you know, lots of people who maybe routinely record wildlife in their back gardens. And that's amazing and really valuable data. But one of the real challenges is accessing that information and having people who contribute it or send it into these different organizations, and having some sort of structure to it. So we know how frequently they're looking, or how thoroughly they're looking, those sorts of things. And actually, once we start collecting that information from lots of people across the country, we can actually have a really positive impact. And it's kind of fitting into what we describe as citizen science, as being a kind of recognized method of research. So having lots of citizens out there collecting these data, looking out for hedgehogs, recording them, reporting carcasses on roads, so things like that, and actually giving that information over to organizations that can really do something with it. Because it might be that one person has 5 or 6 different hedgehogs visiting their garden, but actually hardly anybody else around ever sees them. That could be because they're not looking for them. It could be because they are, you know, all the hedgehogs are kind of tucked in behind vegetation. It could be that their garden's actually really not suited to hedgehogs, and so they're scurrying through very quickly, and so therefore the householder isn't seeing them. So all of these different things can kind of, the more people who are contributing those data to these organizations gives us a better understanding of how much the population is changing. And that could be negatively, as we all know. I'm sure that, you know, hedgehog populations across the nation are declining, and actually that's the same across Europe as well. But at the same time, we are starting to see a bit of a recovery in some parts in urban environments. Yeah. And again, that's because people are reporting them. You know, people like myself can't go out and count every hedgehog and check everybody's gardens. But if every garden holder can check their garden regularly, and look out for hedgehogs, and, you know, report them when they do see them to organisations like PTS and BHBS, then actually that's really, really helpful in giving a much better understanding of what's actually happening with our hedgehog populations.
And it's interesting that just the people that are on this, watching this video from all around the country, and like you're saying, being able to take, for example, as far afield as people looking in Wimbledon to Newcastle to Yorkshire to Oxford, that citizen science really does become a powerful source of information to these organizations, and drawing all of that information together.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's one of the really important things that, you know, if we look at these kind of national maps of hedgehog distribution, there are massive holes in that, and, you know, particularly across the Scottish Highlands, across, you know, quite large patches of Wales, particularly, you know, and how much is it that there are no hedgehogs there, and how much is it that nobody's recorded them or nobody's looked, you know, so it's very, very difficult with a species that is so widespread. It's, you know, found in lots of different habitats, that actually, you know, it's not possible for, you know, an organization to go out and survey all of these places and go looking for them, particularly when we've got a species that is quite elusive. You know, it's quite difficult to find them. They tend to tuck themselves away. They nest in really inconvenient places that, you know, are not easy to find. And so actually, the more people are kind of out looking for them in their gardens, and, you know, keeping an eye out. And I've just noticed one of the people who have joined us tonight has mentioned a trail camera. Really nice way of keeping track of your hedgehogs and seeing what's going on in the garden. Yeah. Sammy's got the trail camera waiting for the SD card. I sorry to get distracted by the trail camera. I've said it many times before in my videos. That is the start of an addiction. That is just. That is an itch that never stops being scratched, because it's absolutely brilliant having a trail camera. So Sammy, we'd love to hear what you see in your garden from that trail camera. Coming back then to the research and your paper, you specifically mention a number of different techniques, and your paper starts to compare the effectiveness of these different techniques. So specifically there's using of the spotlight, which is, the way I see it, is me using the torch in the backyard. But then some really interesting techniques. There's a thermal infrared camera, and finally Specialist Search Dog, which we definitely will come back to. But just those 3 techniques in particular, in summary, what are some of the pros and cons of each of those techniques before we get into kind of more of the detail of each? Okay, so searching for for any nocturnal animal after dark is with spotlights and torches can be a little bit tricky, because firstly, it's not particularly reliable to be able to find them. If we've got kind of big open areas, then perhaps we are going to find them. There's also legal restrictions on using spotlights to what we call classified taking. So if we're kind of removing that animal, if we're, heaven forbid, removing it to kill it, which is obviously nothing that I'm doing, but if people were doing that, then you actually need a license from Natural England to be able to do that. So that's a restriction on it. Things like using spotlights it's kind of the typical method. It's how people usually survey for hedgehogs. And obviously things like head torches easily available, and certainly if you're kind of looking around for them, as long as you're not disturbing them, then no problems. Thermal cameras are a fairly new piece of technology comparatively. I've actually got mine here. I thought I'd bring it along to show you. It's not a small piece of kit. It's quite chunky and quite heavy. It's not as big as it maybe looks on there. You go, comparison. Yeah. But yeah, quite a heavy, chunky piece of kit, which is really, really useful because it gives us that thermal image of the hedgehog. So actually, we don't need to see it at all. We don't need to disturb it. So I have seen hedgehogs from kind of 200 meters away with one of these, across a field, down a hill and into a rugby pitch. I saw but these do cost a lot of money. So, you can get little ones that just attach to a mobile phone, which can be really handy, and a much less invasive way of surveying for hedgehogs. They're much less likely to know you're there. You can then kind of quietly sit there and watch them going about their business without even kind of disturbing them at all.
Yeah.
So thermal imaging is a really good way of surveying for any wildlife, really, all sorts of wildlife. And we use the same technology when I take my students out to South Africa. We do night drives and take thermal cameras with me, and it's just a great way of being able to observe wildlife. And one of the difficult things with spotlights and torches is that as soon as you put the torch near them, then there's a chance they're going to either scarper or they're going to tuck themselves away and try and hide from you.
Yeah.
It's actually, again, with thermal cameras, you don't have that problem. You can just sit and watch them on the screen and see them pottering around and, not be disturbed at all. So, yeah, it's a really nice way of surveying. And I would certainly kind of favour thermal cameras over spotlights.
And it really is, to kind of coin a completely inappropriate phrase, but it really is a non-invasive way by comparison to the spotlight, which, like you say, is shining up the habitat that the animal is actually trying to hide within. You're casting the spotlight that's bright as day, whereas the thermal images, and thank you very much, these are thermal images that you've provided, and there's the use of the camera. These are things that really you're standing at a distance, like you said, 200 meters away, and there's no interference or anything like that with the animal that you are surveying.
Absolutely. And, certainly with things like the thermal camera, it's a great way of being able to see them. Perhaps, it's not very good at finding them in dense vegetation, but certainly if the grass is kind of, if you're close to them, and, you don't have to worry about the visual reliability of a species that is fairly well camouflaged, let's face it. It's to tuck itself away in, fallen leaves and things like that actually they can be quite tricky to find sometimes. But yeah, thermal cameras are great for this sort of thing, and really nice to have that method that you can go and find them without having a negative impact on the animal at all. As I say, they often don't even know you're there.
And what's interesting, sorry to have cut in on you, but what's interesting is even in that photo there where you've got a hedgehog out on the grass, and you've almost got the two methods being shown. You've got spotlight by way of the torch, and you've got the thermal imaging. The hedgehog, I know it's there, you can see it, but at the same time, it's kind of even disappearing into that grass a little bit. So even with the torch, it's a little bit difficult to see, whereas it's clear as day. Literally, on the thermal imaging camera. So that's that kind of comparison, like you say, of how torch can be a difficult thing to use.
Yeah, and actually that is just a head torch. That's not even a spotlight at all. So yeah, that is just a head torch. But yeah, just really trying to kind of show that comparison between the two and how easy it is to see them with that thermal camera.
Okay. And then the third one, which is really different and completely a different direction in terms of surveying, is the Specialist Sniffer Dog.
Yes.
So what is that technique? Is it as literal as it sounds? And what are some of the pros and cons of that then?
So using detection dogs is something that's been done for 100 years or so.
Okay.
If we go, if we kind of link it to comparing to, hunting techniques, however long, going back, way back, I guess, using to find animals. But actually using them for a detection dog purpose is a really important method for finding animals, because as soon as we employ a dog, we're not relying on sight, we're relying on scent. And so in the same way as our thermal camera can show us the hedgehogs that are maybe on a complex background with, lots of leaves and lots of vegetation, the dog can find it without being able to see it at all. So it has a real benefit from that point of view. So they are able to find the hedgehogs that are maybe tucked away in vegetation, in long grass. Henry can find them down rabbit holes. All sorts of different things that mean that actually we are able to find those hedgehogs that are really well concealed. So we can get a much more reliable estimate of the population, and hopefully have a better understanding of what's happening to our population of hedgehogs across the country.
So if we before we come back to the specialist dog, because that is a whole topic of conversation in itself, we've looked at the kind of comparisons, and there's almost a degree of effectiveness which your paper points out in terms of the effectiveness of spotlight versus thermal imaging versus the detection dog. If we come back to some of the things around the thermal camera that might make it, I don't want to sound like I'm arguing with you, but you've made a great point that the thermal camera is an excellent form of surveying and detection, but it's not always effective in all conditions. And I know previously you were even saying that even when the hedgehog might be out in what is warm grass, and that grass is giving off some ambient heat, that actually that there are a couple of factors that can influence how effective the thermal imaging is.
Absolutely. So as soon as we've got vegetation that's kind of covering the hedgehog, we're much less likely to pick up that thermal image, even if that hedgehog's active.
Right.
If we have, as soon as they're, certainly kind of in larger bramble patches, if they're maybe under structures, so things like sheds, if they are concealed in any way pretty much, then the thermal camera is just not going to pick them up. That's particularly challenging during the day. We've got this kind of everything's giving off thermal energy once it, from the sun, and that carries on for about 2 hours after dark. So we have some real challenges there with using thermal cameras to detect nocturnal wildlife. And so the detection dog can work at any time, day or night. He can work in any environment. He can find them regardless of where they are. And, so if, for example, it's a shed's being torn down, he could tell you whether there's hedgehogs underneath it, and, hopefully, again, protect them. And actually, do you know what? There's hedgehogs nesting under there. Can we leave the shed for a little bit? They'll move on and let them go about their own business. Yep.
And so let's talk about, one last question that is a personal question. And I know it got asked on the channel a few months ago when we were in the midst of winter. You've described the fact that the thermal image is most effective when there's this contrast in temperatures, so that the hedgehog's temperature, body temperature, is distinctly different and contrasting to its environment. Is the thermal camera effective during hibernation?
That depends.
Fair enough.
It depends on. So the thermal difference between the two is kind of what we're looking for now.
Yeah.
Hedgehog body temperature gets down to probably kind of 1 to 2 degrees above the environmental temperature, but then of course that doesn't fluctuate in the same way as the environmental temperature does. So if it's been warm during the day and then we have a very cold snap overnight, then that hedgehog's body temperature is going to stay the same, whereas obviously the environmental temperature has massively reduced. So you might be in a situation where, yes, you could detect them because they are considerably warmer than the environment for that short period of time. Mm-hmm. We have to add into that, though, the nest that they're in. And these nests can be very complex. They can be very dense. They, the kind of one of the leading researchers in hedgehog ecology kind of first described hedgehogs building their nests, and they kind of get these big piles of leaves together and then almost do like a somersault in it. So it kind of combs all these leaves over the top of them, and they make a really like well insulated nest. I'm sure some of your viewers have seen these before, but layer upon layer upon layer of leaves. So you get a very thick, dense nest. And that is so important to be able to insulate that animal well within the nest and really protect it from those very cold nights and snowstorms and things like that. And so as soon as we've got that, finding that animal with a thermal camera, we've lost that thermal gradient, that thermal difference, because they're so well insulated, and we possibly only have a few degrees there of temperature difference between the animal itself and the environment. So actually finding hedgehogs in their nest, particularly in hibernation, technically, yes, it's possible particularly if that nest has been disturbed. You know, if somebody's opened up that nest and is letting some of that heat out, yes, we will pick that up.
Okay.
But a completely undisturbed hedgehog nest, almost certainly not. Certainly the hibernation nests, I'd say, is very, very difficult to find with a thermal camera.
And I suppose the answer is the fact that the hedgehog is trying to make themselves a thermally insulated nest to hibernate within. So the fact that if any heat escaped to be seen on the thermal camera, that kind of defeats the purpose of
the nest isn't doing its job properly.
Yeah. Okay. That all said, we now definitely need to move on to Henry, the detection dog, and you sent a picture of suitably called Happy Henry. So people may have seen he has been featured recently on TV. There have been interviews with yourself and his handler Louise, and we've seen him in action on TV. People may have seen snippets of him. How did the concept of I know you spoke about, you know, dogs used for detection is an age-old kind of concept, but where did the idea from using a detection dog for hedgehogs originate and come from? And then let's discuss the star of the show, which is Henry.
He is the star of the show. I don't mind going in Henry's limelight at all. It's fine. So hedgehogs actually spend about 85% of their life in their nest. You know, over the course of the year, there's going to be about 85% of their life that is spent in that nest. So when they're in their nest, they're incredibly vulnerable. And we've already talked about how difficult it is to see them, to find them. The nest is very well camouflaged and tucked away in all those places. So it's incredibly difficult to find them. So they are very vulnerable in their nest, but we don't really have any idea as to how many hedgehogs are lost every year because of areas being cleared. And you know, certainly if we look at kind of housing estate clearance and you know, those sorts of things, then a lot of that work is undertaken over winter to protect nesting birds. But one of the challenges we have is that, you know, you've kind of almost got this nesting bird season starting as hedgehog hibernation finishes. So at any point during the year, there's a risk of either disturbing nesting birds, which legally can't be done, or putting hibernating hedgehogs at risk. And so, very, very difficult to find them. They are highly vulnerable in their nest. And so kind of talking to people like rehabilitators, hedgehog rehabilitators, you know, there's research showing how many hedgehogs are, you know, coming into rehabilitators, having been caught up in strimmers and mowers and, you know, horrible things like that. And so that's really where the motivation came from, to start looking at solutions of, okay, how can we actually start looking at protecting these hedgehogs when they're in the nest, and how can we like identify where they are in order to be able to say, okay, this is an area that we do need to be really careful of. We do need to protect this animal. And can we find a method of saying confidently yes or no, there are no hedgehogs there?
Okay. And it's important at this stage, as we start talking about Henry, to address some probably important public health announcements, and also just to kind of get rid of a few myths and non-truths, so to speak. The first thing is, I've said it often on this channel, the one thing that is a danger to hedgehogs is dogs. Cats and hedgehogs tend to get along well, dogs and hedgehogs not so much. So what's the first thing with regards Henry in particular that is it the breed of dog? Is it just his actual temperament? What makes Henry different to any other dog that may represent a hazard to hedgehogs?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, we know from hedgehog rehabilitation data that dog attack is a very important and noted reason for hedgehogs being admitted to rehabilitation, and also, you know, all those that sadly don't make it as far as the rehabilitator or the wildlife hospital.
Yeah.
So we absolutely, and it was certainly one of the real concerns I had at the start of this project was having dogs working around active hedgehogs, and then also, you know, what would happen once we started putting Henry in a position where he was, or the dog at this time, we didn't know about Henry at the time, putting dogs in a position where they're maybe searching for nests, things like digging for them, you know, and heaven forbid, that's the last thing we wanted. You know, this project was always about hedgehog conservation. It's not about finding hedgehogs to disturb them or to, you know, to cause any welfare issues. And so therefore it was very much about, okay, finding the right dog. And that's where I started working with Louise, who is a professional detection dog handler. I had no aspirations of training my own dog to go and find hedgehogs. It was about working with a professional organisation, and Louise has 18 years of working with detection dogs, has worked in many different sectors, and worked in numerous places across the world. So very much the professional in this. Yep. To go back to your question, sorry, I kind of went off topic a little bit there.
Not a problem. Not a problem at all.
As for kind of what made a good detection dog, or what makes a good dog, and how does he differ? He's a working dog. He's very highly trained to find the scents that he's taught to find.
Yep.
It's a very carefully managed process. Particularly when we were looking at working, you know, if you know, he's trained to say find bird and bat carcasses at wind turbine sites.
Right.
So we don't have the same welfare concerns. You know, that animal has sadly already died as a result of collision with a wind turbine, and so he's finding the carcass. And so that's a very different thing. And, you know, be it his indication might be to bark, for example, to say he's found something. And actually that's, again, the last thing we wanted with working with live animals. It was very much about having a response that wasn't going to affect the hedgehog, was going to have as little impact as possible, and you know, making sure that we didn't cause stress either to the hedgehog or to the dog.
And that's kind of it. You're working towards the ultimate. We were talking earlier about the thermal imaging camera being non-intrusive. This is literally the ultimate non-intrusive. You just almost want him to point it out. It's over there, and not get involved, not dig, not seek, not actually find the hedgehog. He just needs to point in the direction.
Oh, so, absolutely. And it's, sorry to interrupt, but it can actually be quite interesting sometimes when he you know, he's kind of, so his indications say that he's found a hedgehog is to sit down, and he kind of looks up at Louise in a very cute way, but he kind of gets a little bum wiggle as well going, and things like that. So he's very controlled, and he's very excited, but it's very much about him then getting his ball. So he's quite keen to, you know, okay, right, it's somewhere over there, and let's go this way and play with the ball. And so that's kind of a very important part of what makes him so successful. Really kind of avoiding that issue with potentially digging. It's quite funny sometimes when he is adamant that there's a hedgehog maybe in a large bramble patch, and we just can't get to it. You know, it's too dense to get there, and he's kind of sat there wiggling his bottom and, you know, looking really expressionful, lots of enthusiasm, and he's looking towards this bramble patch. And yeah, there's not sometimes nothing we can do to confirm whether it's there or not.
Where it's there, okay. I think that the one thing to kind of just extend the public health warning element a little bit, you've touched on in great detail a number of things. That Henry is incredibly well trained. He is a working dog. Louise has 18 years experience that she's bringing to the party, so to speak. You can't, this is literally, do not try this at home. You can't just take your Labrador or your Jack Russell and decide this is going to be, and do it yourself. This is a very controlled scientific process, and Henry ultimately is extremely well trained.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of part of what we set out to do when we're working together is, Louise is the dog handler. Her responsibility in this partnership is towards the dog, is to look after Henry, manage his working schedule, manage his social engagements, and there are many of those now since the one show particularly.
Yeah.
Those sorts of things. It's very much about her handling Henry and making sure that he's doing what he should be doing. He's searching effectively, rewarding him when she needs to, and my responsibility is towards the hedgehogs, so making sure that again there's no interaction between the hedgehog and Henry. Henry's taken away as soon as he's indicated that there's he's picked up the scent of the hedgehog, things like that. But it's then Henry can leave, and if I'm actually needing to do anything with the hedgehog, maybe it's to health check it or weigh it and things like that if we're doing a research project. But it might be just simply confirm that there's a hedgehog there. Yes, I can see that there's a nest there, and so therefore we can identify that yes, there is a nest and a hedgehog is present.
And beyond the science and the research projects, what are some of the practical applications? I'm sorry to make Henry suddenly have a career in hedgehog detection, but what are some of the practical applications for a detection dog like Henry in a real world scenario? And I mean something beyond just scientific research and surveying. Is there something where an application where this could be, you could have a team of Henrys doing a specific job, and what might that job be?
So it could be that, for example, where we know that areas of land are going to be cleared, we could use Henry to help support identifying where there are hedgehogs on that site. So we've got no idea, for example, how many hedgehogs are killed every year during building site clearance, through things like grass verge mowing, those sorts of practices which are going on in our own towns and cities every day. But we have no idea how many hedgehogs are killed during those practices. And, certainly with some of these very large industrial mowers and, very large diggers and things like that, those hedgehogs just wouldn't even be known about at all. So what we can use Henry for is trying to get an idea on how many hedgehogs are lost to such practices. And again, we can help maybe inform industry as to how to improve this. We could also look at things like if we know an area, say of bramble or hedgerow, things like that, is frequently used for nesting hedgehogs. Again, can we work with people to actually say, do you know what, that's a really important habitat, can we protect it? Everybody loves a hedgehog, everybody wants to protect, or I'd like to think everybody wants to protect hedgehogs. Sadly, it's not always the case, but there's a lot of interest in protecting hedgehogs. And can we, by saying actually that's a really important patch of ground for hedgehogs, can we protect them? And then it could be, for example, if areas are being mown, we can say, actually, do you know what, there's some hedgehog nests here and here, leave them for a few days, and I'm sure the hedgehogs will be moving on. And actually that area can then just be mown afterwards once we know that nest is no longer being used. And whilst my primary motivation would always be to protect the whole habitat and protect that whole patch for those animals and to leave it intact, not just for hedgehogs but biodiversity much more widely. Reality is that sadly that's not the case. So okay, if we can't leave the whole patch alone, can we at least protect the animal in situ and try and keep it alive that way?
And it sounds like this form of detection gives us a lot of the ability to be proactive in these things, and kind of not having to be reporting the carcasses afterwards or the dead hedgehog sightings after the fact, being able to actually proactively say there are hedgehogs in these areas and we should adapt our behavior, our activity, our mowing the lawn in such a way that we actively protect them. And so that proactiveness comes into play, and you are bringing that protection to the animal. Absolutely.
And if we can highlight to, say, building developers just how much their sites are being used by hedgehogs, again, hopefully we can open up that conversation about things like hedgehog highways on housing estates. And some developers are actually kind of really cottoning onto this now, which is absolutely brilliant, and implementing hedgehog highways through their new developments, which is absolutely brilliant and something we'd really want to support. And the more we can work with the industry to be able to say, yes, this is something that your site is currently being used for, and your site is very important to hedgehogs, or maybe it's that hedgehogs are currently residing on that land, but then accessing somewhere else, maybe the golf course next door, for example. So again, can those two pieces of land remain connected somehow? Again, so we can maintain that natural habitat for hedgehogs and keep that population thriving.
Yeah, because like we discussed this earlier in the week, I know, and what came up was this whole point, which was what Hugh and I were discussing earlier as well, in terms of the protection of hedgehogs from a legal perspective, from the law perspective, is not as great as the law protects. For example, you mentioned nesting birds, things like great crested newts. There are certain animals that enjoy a greater degree of legal protection from, certainly in the UK, from our law than hedgehogs do. So it's not a case of, because hedgehogs don't have that protection from a developer coming in and going to clear a site and build a new range of houses, we need to be that proactive and be able to point these things out again to try and not necessarily change, but impact the behavior of that developer. We may not get the estate not built, but we could get it built in a way that protects the hedgehogs.
Absolutely. And yeah, it comes down to the Wildlife and Countryside Act. So great crested newts, for example, are Schedule 5, hedgehogs are Schedule 6. So it's illegal to take and kill hedgehogs with certain methods, but they don't have nearly the same degree of legal protection as great crested newts, bats, species like that. So it does present some real challenges there for actually protecting not only the hedgehogs themselves, but hedgehog habitat. So that's absolutely fundamental, is finding ways that we can have that conversation with industry, have that conversation with householders, whoever it is. And actually that's one of the other areas that we've kind of talked about with Henry, is that, not Henry directly, obviously. He's too busy for me. He doesn't have time for these things. But things like bonfires, having Henry, and Louise has done a little bit of this in her local area, of taking Henry out, checking bonfires to see if there's hedgehogs nesting. And again, whilst we would absolutely encourage people to build the bonfire, or at least move it on the day that they're going to light it, we have no idea how many hedgehogs are lost to bonfires, and and particularly like large public displays. Those hedgehogs, those bonfires could be in position for days, even weeks before they're lit. And who knows how many hedgehogs there are nesting in that structure before it gets lit. And Henry could tell you with fairly good certainty whether there's a hedgehog nest in there within a minute or two.
And that is a powerful thing for Henry to be able to do, to be able to demonstrate the presence of the hedgehog that no one can actually see, and kind of bring that message to the fore, that these are areas that hedgehogs would regularly be found in. They would nest and sleep and hibernate in these types of bonfires, for example. And just being able to illustrate that and demonstrate that to the public is really a strong message in itself.
Indeed. And I guess it's one of those real challenges with the behavior that we see in hedgehogs, of nesting in these places that we might build it as a bonfire. They've got no idea why it's there. It just looks like a great place to nest. And likewise with compost heaps and all those sorts of places that we've built them for our own purpose, but actually to them it's just a great place to nest. And the more we can have an understanding of managing those places, and again all your listeners thinking about when they're shoveling through the compost heap, and there could very well be a hedgehog nesting in there, so do it really carefully, sort through it carefully, and be really vigilant. And strimming areas, mowing areas, and we can do these things in our own gardens. What we can't do it is on an industrial scale, when council workers perhaps have very little time to mow lots of areas of grass, of grass verge, things like that they're not able to go through, and otherwise it's a fingertip search of every grass verge before they mow it. It's just not realistic, whereas Henry can walk down it and go, no, there's no hedgehogs, or there's one just there.
Absolutely. So what is next, just to bring it all to a close? That is a piece of research, I believe, which was released in February of this year. I think that paper was published. I'm going to get that horribly wrong.
I think.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I think it was December. No, it's fine. I think it was December.
But what's next? Because you continue to do research, and you were telling me previously that some more research has just been, you're just pulling all the findings together. So where is the next piece of research a kind of extension on what you've done, or is it something completely new and different?
So the study that we published just before Christmas was looking at active hedgehogs. But actually, that's not the application of what we want to do at all. The main application is finding the nest. So the data we've just finished collecting is looking at finding hedgehogs in the nest, how reliable he is at finding them. And so, yeah, I need to write that one up, and hopefully that'll be published very soon. And as for what comes after that, I'm not too sure at the moment. We're certainly keen to look at putting this into practice with industry. Yeah. We've kind of talked to various builders, we've talked kind of contractors, we've talked to ecologists. So looking at how can we use, if ecologists are already doing hedgehog surveys, can we bring Henry into that to provide another dimension to that survey and hopefully get much more reliable data. And then also I do work with rehabilitation, hedgehog rehabilitation community as well. So again, trying to understand the causes of admission to hospitals, yep. Trying to understand how much that affects the outcome of that care as well. Are there certain conditions that are much more likely to lead to fatality of those animals, and therefore much less likely to have a success rate that we'd like to see of those animals going back out into the wild as healthy individuals that can hopefully go on to breed.
Okay.
So, yeah,
and yes, you're not going to ever have a quiet day anytime soon. There's lots of research to be done. Will we see more Henrys is the question.
Yes, absolutely. Now we know that Henry works, then Louise is certainly happy to kind of look at training another dog. Okay. I think she's got 10 different dogs for various different purposes, including one or two who are retired, but they're very much dogs for life with her. They're all rescue dogs that come in and then do lots. I mean, Henry, for example, I think Louise was his 5th home. Wow. Even though he was only kind of 8 or 9 months old, he was a very hyperactive, very troubled teenager. He had a really tough start in life. And not the easiest pet at all, but now he's got a purpose. He's really thrived, and I think that's a really important part of who Henry is. That is that difficult start to life, and he's certainly got an incredible work ethic. And is it right to talk about these things about an animal? I don't know, but we'll go with it. But yeah, certainly incredibly hardworking, and it seems that he would quite happily carry on working well after. Certainly I'm ready to call it a night, but Louise is equally hardworking. But absolutely, and that's when it kind of starts getting really valuable, is having multiple dogs that you can then search much bigger sites. And actually, of course, in all of this, the dog's welfare is fundamental too. Yeah. So having dogs working as long as we would work just isn't the right thing. They have to have regular breaks. They have to have an opportunity to go back to their kennel and really rest and take it easy. So as much as Henry doesn't like to, he does have some rest time between them and things like that as well.
I can imagine he's a bit hyperactive and doesn't really want to rest.
Yeah, and then he gets home and he'll have a little chill on the sofa for 5 minutes, and then it's time to go for another walk.
and of course all of his social engagements that you were talking about, because I'm sure his diary is quite full with him being on so many different platforms, and he's Absolutely. Had a couple of TV appearances and the like. So
he has, and we've just started having conversations with the Hedgehog Friendly Campus campaign as well.
Oh, brilliant!
So he started doing a few social events for them as well, and kind of going and doing some demonstrations at universities. So again, it's a really nice opportunity for us to be able to do those sorts of things with the restrictions on COVID, from COVID and so on, that students have been unable to engage with university life in so many ways. So getting them out on their campuses, out in the fresh air, where they can see some cool stuff happening is a really nice thing to be involved with. So yes, he's had a few of those engagements lately as well, and Louise is incredibly hard working with him.
And it's we're looping right back to the very first question almost, in terms of, it's just amazing to see all of the different strands of research and projects and things like that actually coming together. You mentioned Hedgehog Friendly Campus, which is another campaign run by I think it's I'm going to get it wrong, it's Hedgehog Street and the British Hedgehog Preservation Society. And all of these things work together. There's no individual strand that just stands out there on its own. They all are working together in the background for hedgehog conservation. It's amazing to see it all come together in that way.
Yeah, and again, if we can get Henry out on university campuses, maybe checking areas that are going to be cleared, or before areas are mown, all those sorts of things, and at the same time getting students involved in that, and getting students observing that and learning about how to safely survey for wildlife, and developing that really important understanding of welfare of both the animals that we're asking to work for us, but then also the animals that we're looking for and trying to protect themselves. And actually, I've just seen one of your listeners is a student ambassador for Hedgehog Friendly Campus. That's absolutely brilliant to hear.
Brilliant.
Well done. Keep it up.
Brilliant. Yes, that was Soph. Well done. Thank you, Soph. While I have a PhD in hedgehogs, who better to answer some viewer questions? So I'm going to just loop you in before I let you go for the evening. Again, thank you very much for your time. It's been absolutely brilliant hearing all about Henry. There are a couple of questions that have come in before and during the course of the evening. Anne, good evening. Anne, if you're here, welcome. She talks about she's got some regular visitors, hedgehog visitors to her garden, but her question is, she's actually got a couple of questions. Firstly, do related hedgehogs, will they breed together?
I don't know on this for definite, but I would hazard a guess that yes, probably. I mean, males do tend to disperse. Male home ranges are larger than females, so right. It's certainly highly probable that juvenile males are moving kind of out of the area. So by chance, they're unlikely to come across their mother or siblings. Mm-hmm. But I know certainly from my own work of surveying hedgehogs at Hartpury, I have found a male in a compromising position with the female that I knew to be his mother. So it does happen. If that population is large and outbreeding, lots of different animals coming in from different places, it's unlikely to cause problems. But it's where we get these very isolated populations, it's more likely to be an issue. That's particularly on some smaller islands and places like that.
Okay. And Anne continues and asks a question that probably a lot of people have a similar issue with, in terms of one of her neighbors has got what she calls very yappy dogs. And so is there any impact that the dogs are in a different garden? So there's no physical contact between the dogs and the hedgehogs, but the fact that they are yappy and might be out in the evening, is that going to be a disturbance to the hedgehogs at all? Will they try and avoid avoid the dogs and the noise?
It could very well be. It's a bit of a difficult one. We do know that hedgehogs want to avoid close contact with dogs, which was certainly one of the motivations with Henry, of making sure he didn't get too close. He only kind of gets kind of within about half a meter, that sort of distance. So he's not getting really close to the dogs, hedgehogs, sorry. So yes, they don't particularly want to be close to dogs. Some research suggests that they're less likely to frequently use gardens that are inhabited by dogs. And so it could potentially cause problems. It could be that actually the hedgehogs are still going through that garden. They're just kind of getting through it as quickly as possible and then moving into, sorry, was it Anne's garden?
Yes, that was Anne's garden.
Yeah. So it could be that they're, kind of not hanging around in the neighbour's garden because they don't want to be around the dogs. But yeah, it's possible that they're having an impact, but actually, again, because hedgehogs tend to roam quite far and wide, then hopefully it's not discouraging them too much. It might be that they're just less inclined to nest in that garden if the dogs are particularly noisy. And off the back of that, I'd suggest that if any of your listeners do have dogs, and certainly kind of letting them out after dark for that kind of late night pee, then keeping close supervision of them is really helpful. It could be that you've got hedgehogs visiting your garden, and keep an eye out for hedgehogs. Keep an eye out for your dog. Depending on keep an eye on what it's doing. Just making sure it's not kind of interacting with any of the hedgehogs that are out and about, and certainly not picking them up. So supervision after dark, if you've got dogs, I definitely recommend as being really important.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. That's brilliant. Another question Richard asks, and again, this might be a very common question to people who have hedgehogs visiting and who are leaving food out. Can rats transmit diseases to hedgehogs?
This is a good question, one I'm not terribly confident on, I'm afraid. I would hazard a guess at yes. There are various diseases that rats can carry and transmit, which can be transmitted to all sorts of different species. So I'd hazard a guess at yes. But again, it depends on how much close contact they're coming into, if it's just kind of a passing interaction or the odd interaction to feed bowl, things like that. So making sure your food bowls are regularly washed and in hot soapy water, and the area around the feeding station is also regularly cleaned and disinfected. Those sorts of things will really help with avoiding disease transmission, but actually should be really good practice anyway. And we know, as having bird garden feeders and things like that, again, that hygiene of those items is really, really important to manage disease in wildlife.
Yeah. Okay. Last question, and then I will let you go. But this is an interesting one as well. Sophie has asked, how can she encourage her local neighbours to consider improving their gardens to help hedgehogs' habitat? And probably, again, a question that a lot of people are asking as we want to kind of share our hedgehogs, so to speak, with and encourage the hedgehogs to visit other gardens. We want to encourage our neighbors to improve those habitats for those hedgehogs. What are some of the things you might encourage your neighbors to do?
So the first thing would always be connecting gardens. So the more we can have this network of gardens that hedgehogs can get to, then all the better. So hedgehog holes, just an area about kind of 13 centimeters. I used to say, everybody says about the size of a CD-ROM, but then somebody then asked me what a CD-ROM was. So maybe we're getting to that stage.
we need to recalibrate the size of a hedgehog hole into something more. It's the size of a Samsung Galaxy latest model.
Yeah. So about 13 centimeters is the ideal. So connecting gardens together and ideally having a couple of holes in ideally opposite sides of the garden. Encouraging them to be able to move through the garden, and at least that way, even if you do have a garden that's perhaps less suited to wildlife, things like patios or heaven forbid artificial grass and things like that, then actually the hedgehog might not hang around. It's just going to move straight through, and that's absolutely fine. Get on to the next place. So connecting gardens is my number one tip. Making it as wildlife friendly as possible, and hedgehogs are a great species for getting people enthusiastic about making changes to their garden, because everybody wants to see hedgehogs in their garden.
Yeah.
People aren't necessarily quite so enthusiastic about other species, and they don't get quite so passionate about frogs and toads and things like that, and invertebrates and all those other parts of biodiversity that are so crucial to our entire ecosystem. So anything you can do to kind of make your garden that little bit more friendly to wildlife generally. So mature vegetation, log piles, compost heaps, lots of avoiding chemicals. That's a really important one. If we're using pesticides all the time, we're just killing the food that hedgehogs are there to eat. And the more we can encourage hedgehogs in, we can encourage garden birds in. Actually, they're going to be eating those invertebrates that we might otherwise describe as pests. So actually, if you're using pesticide, you're actually using hedgehog foodicide. Think of it like that.
Yeah, that's true.
We're just killing hedgehog food. So the more you can encourage natural hedgehog food and things like that. Feeding hedgehogs can be a really good way of encouraging them in as well. But again, just bear in mind that point about biosecurity around feeding stations and things like that. Make sure you clean it all down really, really well, and make sure you wash your hands thoroughly afterwards as well, because they can transmit disease to humans if we're not careful. Okay. And then things like garden ponds as well. Hedgehogs can swim. They can climb. They have been known to climb over kind of 6-foot fences. But the more you can open it up, the more you can make sure that if they fall into the pond, they can get out, cover drains, things like that. Hedgehogs are quite clumsy. We were talking about this earlier, weren't we, beforehand, that they kind of dive off things and jump in things, and they are quite clumsy. They're not necessarily the most what's the word, quite ungainly at times.
They're not elegant by any means.
They're not.
nor athletic, really.
Yeah, so making sure that they can get themselves out of trouble. They are kind of experts at getting into trouble. And then things like netting are a problem as well. So if you're, a vegetable gardener and you've got netting down to the ground, roll it up, get it up kind of, 15, 20 centimetres off the ground, that they're not going to get tangled up in that netting. So, and then checking your compost heaps before you put forks into them is the other one.
Absolutely.
And before mowing, trimming, all those sorts of things, do keep a good lookout. And particularly at the moment, because we've got nests of hedgehogs starting to be around, of lots of hoglets, and sadly if hedgehog nests get disturbed with hoglets in, there's a chance that female is either going to kill the babies or she's going to abandon that nest. So if you know that you've got hedgehogs nesting in your garden, do stay well clear. Maybe put a trail camera up a good distance away and you might see mum coming and going. But certainly don't be opening nest boxes and things like that. It's really important that they're just completely left alone. And that's especially important at this time of year when we have lots of very young hoglets around.
Absolutely. Sophie, that is a whole range of things that hopefully Lucy has helped you out with. Thank you very much for your question, Sophie. But more importantly, Lucy, I've kept you well beyond the time that I promised to keep you. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for your time and for your insight, and just for it's been wonderful to have a PhD in hedgehogs and have that literal subject matter expert talking. And thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your research and the stuff that you're doing that is helping other organizations, both locally and with, for example, your work with Sophie Rasmussen in Denmark, internationally throughout Europe. And thank you so much for the efforts that you do on behalf of hedgehogs and for joining us on Hedgehogs Hollow. It's been an absolute delight. Thank you so much. At all.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I've really enjoyed it. And you said that you've had Hugh Warwick with you. He's much more of an expert than I am. So yes, certainly. Yeah.
No, it's been an absolute pleasure, and he spoke very highly of you. He may be a more expert, but he spoke very highly of you when we chatted. So it's lovely to have you. Thank you so much.
So it's great to hear that.
Thank you to you as well for joining. It's been wonderful to have you along with us this evening. And do get in touch and leave messages in the comments if you've got anything to say about Henry, the hedgehog detection dog, and the work that Lucy is doing. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you again, Lucy, and a pleasure to have you along. Until next time on Hedgehogs Hollow, from myself, Mike, and from Lucy, take care. Bye-bye.